We're going to spend our time today in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, looking at what might be the most important subject in the world. You know, the first verse I want to call your attention to is verse 18. It's going to set the tone for the other verses we'll look at. Paul said, the message of the cross is foolish to those who are headed for destruction. But we who are being saved know it is the very power of God. So right off the bat, you have two different groups of people. You have the people who are being lost, who are heading for destruction. You have the saved who understand that the cross is the very power of God. And so the central object in the center of these two groups of people, the cross. You know, certain products just sell themselves. They don't need any advertising. They don't need any marketing at all. You know, sunscreen at the beach, right? Plywood before a hurricane. Doesn't need any advertising. Doesn't need any marketing. Toilet paper on a camping trip. Or apparently now in a COVID pandemic. Tums or Beano at a chili cook-off. I could have left that one out, couldn't I? Some products just sell themselves. You know, Walmart doesn't have to run a special on them. I mean, they don't need any marketing. They don't need any advertising whatsoever. The demand is so great, sell themselves. So you would think that when God strategized salvation, He would have come up with a plan so appealing that it would sell itself. No reason for people like me to stand up here week after week and preach and plead and maybe even sometimes beg. The need would be so apparent and the solution so attractive that you couldn't keep people from running to it. Salvation, you might say, would be hard to keep in stock. And yet, God did the exact opposite of that. That means that God devised to forgive us of all of our sins, make us all His children and His heirs, clean up our lives, guarantee us a home in heaven, but rather than the object that He used to do so selling itself, He used an object of shame and suffering so repulsive and so repugnant that many people today simply cannot deal with it, nor could they in the first century. God deliberately made salvation tough to swallow. You've got to gulp hard to get it down. This text we're going to read in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 says, the message of the cross is simply not palatable to most human taste. In fact, it's an offense to many sensibilities. And that's exactly as God planned. It is foolish to the Jews, and it's foolish to the Greeks. We'll discuss that in a little more depth and a little later on. Now, the trend in churches today is to be trendy. It really is. We tend to value relevance and that above pretty much all other traits. It's about being cool and hip and polished and relevant and non-offensive and maybe even politically correct. And understand, I'm not at all against being relevant. I believe that our job is to bring a changeless God and a changeless gospel to a changing world. I do believe that. But when a church values relevance above all else, it often shies away from the message of the cross, and you hear less and less about sin. And you hear less and less about the cross. Because the cross is simply not relevant to today's culture or to any culture. It's an offense. for any human being to bear. It was in the first century when Paul wrote these words, still is today. So we've tried to sanitize it a great deal. A church that's all about slick presentations and engaging entertainment and how-to suggestions and self-massaging sermons to the neglect of the cross has missed the whole point of its existence. True story. Leadership magazine tells about a church called the British Chapel in England. And they had a beautiful old building, and it was kind of like Wrigley Field in Chicago with the ivy-covered walls on the outside of the building, and just next to the ivy was the sign, "We preach Christ crucified." But after a little while, the ivy grew over the crucified, and so it only said, "We preach Christ." And after a little while longer, the ivy grew over Christ, and they never trimmed back the ivy, so it said, "We preach." And slowly, the trendy evolution in that church was exactly that. They went from "we preach Christ crucified" to "we just preach the good things about Christ," the nice, innocuous things, to "we just preach." We preach about the social issues of the day. We preach about political correctness. We preach current events. We preach pop psychology. And then the ivy grew over preach. And it was just we. The church had become all about us, our needs, our desires, our opinions, our wants. And it's easy for that to happen. And for us to forget that the centrality of the gospel is the cross. Today, in many ways, the cross has been sanitized and popularized and even secularized. But in the beginning of Christianity, the cross offended senses. It was ugly, grotesque, revolting, disgusting. Anybody who ever saw a crucifixion never forgot it. That's why Paul begins this text by saying the message of the cross is foolish for those who are headed for destruction, but we who are being saved know it is the very power of God. Paul says to those who are lost, the message of the cross is utter foolishness. What is this about a man dying on a cross? That's weak. That's shameful. But to those who are being saved, it is utter power. No one who sees the cross for what it really is can possibly ignore it. Because the cross is right in your face. It is to be reckoned with. God intends for the cross to offend our senses and grab our attention. How odd it is sometimes today to see celebrities with tattooed crosses. Sometimes on their chest, sometimes on their arms. And sometimes I'll see a celebrity or an athlete like that and I'll think, do they really know what that is and what that means? How odd it is to see a baseball player before he steps in the batter's box to cross himself. Or to see somebody in a jewelry store as jewelers beat down their gold into earrings and necklaces in the shape of a cross. Even candy makers market chocolate candy crosses for Christians to eat on Good Friday. But God chose the message of the cross to shock us, to stir us, to offend our senses. And I believe That's why Satan has seen to it that the cross has been stripped of much of its shock effect. I mean, after all, if we're wearing it around our neck, if we're doing it before we go to the batter's box, if we have it as a tattoo on our body, is it that offensive? Does it really shock our senses? Reminds me of the woman who walked into a jewelry store and she asked the man at the counter if she could see a gold cross, and the man said, "A plain one or one with a little man on it?" We're desensitized to the shock of the cross. While the cross was the most hideous, torturous method of execution maybe ever devised. That's what Josephus, the Jewish historian in the first century, said. And he saw his firsthand share of crosses, and he called the cross the single most wretched form of death. Even members of the early church in the first century were repulsed by the cross. And so the church was banned from depiction in the arts for the first 4 centuries of the church's history. You could not use the cross in art. And then Emperor Constantine came along and outlawed crucifixion and sanctioned Christianity. And suddenly, for the first time in the 4th century, you could use the cross. And that first happened when Christianity was being watered down as the national religion, so to speak. But I like what C.S. Lewis once said: the crucifixion did not become common in art until all who had seen a real one had died off. If you had stood before a live crucifixion, you would shiver in horror. It would turn your stomach. You would have nightmares for days. That's why Frank Bernard, when he wrote the song we're going to sing as our invitation hymn this morning, "The Old Rugged Cross," called it the emblem of suffering and shame. The cross was not the emblem of salvation to the world. It was an emblem of suffering. It was an emblem of shame. And who wants suffering? And who wants shame? With all the bad that shame can do to your life. And I think that's why a few years ago, The Passion of the Christ, the movie, was so impactful. It's because for the first time, modern technology and modern filmmakers, I mean, we'd had films before the crucifixion back in the 50s and 60s and maybe even into the 70s. But for the first time, we had all the availability of modern technology, and the realism seemed so powerful that people crawled out of those theaters crying. People who had sinned turned themselves into the police. They were so moved by what they had seen in the passion of the Christ on the cross. We saw it as it would look in real life, and we understood what C.S. Lewis said. No one who had ever seen it would ever make art of it. I mean, just imagine me walking into church today wearing a little gold electric chair around as a necklace on my neck. Imagine me wearing any necklace, but anyway, especially one, a gold electric chair. Or imagine me coming in with a hypodermic needle pinned to my sweater. Instruments of death in our government today. People would think I was crazy. They would be appalled. And in the first century, when Paul wrote to the Corinthians about the message of the cross, it was the equivalent of me coming in here today and preaching to you about the message of the electric chair, or the message of the gas chamber, or the message of lethal injection. You see, when you see the Roman cross standing against the dark Jerusalem sky late in the afternoon on a lonely hill called Calvary, God wants you to think this was just not business as usual here. Something heavy happened here. Something to shock our senses. But the cross not only shocks our senses, it chokes our pride. Paul's pretty bold about this. He claims that through the cross, God intended to leave the philosophers and the scholars and the world's brilliant debaters behind. He has made the wisdom of this world look foolish. At the foot of the cross, Paul sort of taunts the smartest humans. He challenges the university professors and the academics. Put the cross under your microscope and see if you can dissect its power. Not even humanity's brightest minds can get their mind around the wisdom of God, he says. The brilliance of the cross humbles us, since God in his wisdom saw to it that the world would never know him through human wisdom. He has used our foolish preaching to save those who believe. Now here's something I want you to understand, and don't get out of here and misquote me. God is not saying that there's not value to human wisdom. God is not saying that there's not value to education. God is not saying there's not value to human learning. He's not against wisdom or education or human learning. He just didn't choose those things as vehicles for communicating his divine message. He chose a cross. It's not what we would anticipate from God. It's a twist in the plot nobody could expect. You like a good TV show series or a good movie that has an incredible twist in the plot that just sort of leaves you gasping? There's no twist in any plot that leaves people gasping like this one. The emblem of suffering and shame. God is all powerful. He's all wise. He destroys the wicked. He vindicates the righteous. So why in the world does he use the cross as the emblem of suffering and shame, allowing evil men to torture and kill his perfect and sinless son? Because God's trying to get a message across to us that nobody else could get across in any other way. Man has a problem. It's a sin problem. It won't get better on its own. The cross is an affront to our ability to fix things. Man simply cannot fix himself. And only at the cross do we understand and see that. I can't fix this. If I could fix my sin-wrecked soul, if I could repair my broken heart, if I could clean up my record, if I could whitewash my dirty mind, then Jesus would never have had to go to the cross, and Calvary would be unnecessary. But the cross was intended to humble us. And you see, when he said it's not, in 1 Corinthians 1, it's not about human learning or education or the wise philosophers. You see, since salvation comes to the cross, there's nothing we can do. I mean, it was intended to humble us. If salvation came through power, we would all start lifting weights. But it doesn't. If salvation came through knowledge, we'd all go back to school and we would participate in lifelong learning. But it doesn't. It only comes through the crucified Christ. No human pride can save you. But at the cross, he also ridicules our human values, God does. He said, it's foolish to the Jews who ask for signs from heaven. It's foolish to the Greeks who seek human wisdom. Well, if you know anything about both those groups, here's the two poles, the outer poles of belief and experience. The Jews wanted a sign. They wanted power. I'll explain that a little more in just a second. The Greeks wanted philosophy and education and human wisdom. And so the cross stood in the center of both and couldn't reach either audience because of that. I think it's fitting. They expected from God what they valued the most. The Jews, power, a miracle sign. The Greeks, wisdom, philosophy. But the cross appealed to neither power or knowledge. In fact, the cross was an indication of weakness. And isn't that interesting that God gave them the two things they least would have wanted? Weakness and foolishness. Who considers weakness to be a virtue? Who considers foolishness, rather than wisdom and learning and education, to be a virtue? God gave them both the exact opposite of what they wanted. And in doing so, he was scoffing at their human values. The Jews wanted a Messiah who was just as powerful as the heroes of their past. They wanted another David who would conquer the Philistines. They wanted another Moses who would lead them out of Egyptian bondage, except this time Roman bondage. They wanted another hero from the past, a political power. And because at first they thought he was that, they followed him in enormous crowds, watching him heal people, watching him raise the dead, watching him feed the thousands with a few loaves and fishes. But the minute he started talking about a cross, that bandwagon emptied. Emptied. They wanted a Savior with a powerful punch, not a Savior who was a suffering servant. And the Greeks were no better off. They were into knowledge. You remember, they were the descendants of Socrates and Plato. They were the great philosophers of the day. In their most famous city, in Athens, their favorite pastime was carefully crafting philosophies and then debating them on Mars Hill with the other scholars. Paul did that, you remember, on Mars Hill in Acts chapter 19 with them. And out-debated them, I might say. But where exactly was the brilliance and the sophistication and the intellectual triumph of the cross? 2,000 years have passed and done almost nothing to alter human values, make them worse. We're still drawn to those with clout and power. We still make cult figures out of politicians or celebrities or athletes or musicians who seem to have power and influence. We sort of worship the famous, the sexy, the strong, the privileged, the smart, the political. They are always at center stage among us. We're still impressed with education and reputation and sophistication. In fact, the two anathemas in our society are to be either foolish or to be weak. And that's exactly what God intended. You see, the cross is a satire on what we treasure the most. And in that way, God tries to get our attention, and it ain't subtle. On the cross, God is sort of mocking our beauty and our brawn and our brains. He's making fun of our puny muscles that atrophy. I don't care who you are. He's making fun of our shallow logic that is ever changing, no matter how wise or smart you are. He is making fun of our preoccupation with appearance that always fades away. I saw Miss America 1953 the other day on television. She ain't looking so hot. It's always going to happen. Always going to happen. It's God's attempt to rearrange our priorities and our values. The cross is God's way of saying, we've gotten what's really important all twisted up. To those called by God to salvation, both Jews and Gentiles, Christ is the power of God and the wisdom of God. The foolish plan of God is wiser than the wisest of human plans, and God's weakness is stronger than the greatest of human strength. But there's one last thing in this text that I have to show you that I think is most valuable. If I had to say listen to one thing in the lesson, this would be it. While the cross does all those other things that I just mentioned according to this text, the main thing it does is it captures our heart. For once you've seen the cross for what it truly is, it captures you. And God knew that the cross initially would be repulsive. He knew that we'd have to get over our cultural refinement to accept it. He knew that to embrace the cross, we'd have to humble our hearts and step out over our own sinful pride. He knew it would challenge our values and force us to reassess and rearrange our priorities. But he also knew this. He knew that once you did that, you could never get away from it. It would change your life forever. For how can you refuse a love that bore the cross? See, the message of the cross is not a product that sells itself. On the surface, there are formidable barriers that have to be overcome. That's why not everybody sees it. The cross, though, sees to it that we come to God on His terms, not on our terms. And so we're going to sing here in a minute something I want to point out to you in the song. On a hill far away stood an old rugged cross, the emblem of suffering and shame. And circle that word. And I love that old cross. Don't sing it if you don't mean it. I'm serious. I am as serious as a heart attack right now. When we stand in a minute and sing, if you don't love that old rugged cross, don't say it. You know what that is? That's heresy. But if God has changed your life, and you do really love that old cross, sing it with gusto. And I love that old cross where the dearest and best for a world of lost sinners was slain. And pull over here and park on this word. So I'll cherish the old rugged cross. Cherish takes love one step further. You can love something, but when you cherish it, you've pedestaled that up just a tad, haven't you? So I'll cherish the old rugged cross till my trophies at last I lay down. And then circle that word. I will cling to the old rugged cross. Because what you really love, what you really cherish, you don't ever want to let go of. You cling to it. Maybe like you cling to a husband or wife, that if you're a newlywed, God has so blessed you with such a love that you can't help but cherish it and cling to it. Or if you've been married 60 or 70 years and your whole life is wrapped up in that person, you can't help but cherish and cling to one you love so much. Yeah, it's interesting. God chooses for us to enter his kingdom through the door of paradox. Accept the weakness of the cross and he unleashes his awesome power. Embrace the foolishness of the cross and he'll introduce you to his boundless wisdom and knowledge. And this text says the world may not understand it. It may be foolishness to them, but this text also says it is the power of God to those of us who believe it. One story to close, true story. A man named Dave used to manage and run a youth camp in Alabama. On top of the mountain, at the top of the hill in the camp is a huge cross that illuminated at night. And one day a man appeared on his doorstep and asked if he could see the cross. So the two of them, at night, walked up the mountain. The man explained the reason for his visit. He was the pilot of a small plane that had taken off from Atlanta to Birmingham, and then he had got caught up in terrible fog, and he had actually been considering suicide for a long time. And that's why he went ahead and took off. He knew the weather was bad. But then when the crux of the moment came, he panicked and he decided he wanted to live. And he said he prayed to God for the first time in years, God, if you'll help me get this plane down, I promise I'll serve you again and I'll come home to you. And he said just then, breaking through the fog just a little bit, was an illuminated cross on the side of a mountain. And the air controllers, who had not known where he was, knew where the cross was. And so by instrument, they could help him fly to a landing field where he landed the plane safely. And now he wanted to find that cross, so he had tracked it down. And as the two of them got to the top of that mountain that night where that illuminated cross was, his new friend dropped to his knees and prayed, Lord, I have found my way back, and I promise I will never be the same, and I will always be home. The cross has led many a person back to God. Because here is where God gets our attention and reorders our priorities and abolishes our pride. And here is where we cling to and cherish the love we have for the old rugged cross. And it forms a cord so strong that it will never break. That's what 1 Corinthians 1 is talking about. And that's what we're about to sing. Let's not only embrace the message of the cross, let's relish it, rejoice in it, marvel at it, and preach it to those who are lost, even if it seems like foolishness to them.